thank you so much for coming along to today's webinar on that subject that I feel like we're all talking about at the moment, the Digital Operational Resilience Act. And I assure you all there will be no references to DORA the Explorer during today's webinar, as I've heard that way too much over the last few years. This is coming into force on January 17th, 2025, and will impact people throughout the financial services sector. It's very wide scale, and yeah, it's going to be a very big deal. In the last few months, we've seen plenty of regulators throughout the EU issuing guidance, DSEO letters, consultations on the implementation of this mammoth piece of regulation. Before we get started today on what I'm certain will be a very fruitful discussion, we have some really good speakers. I'd like to walk you through what we do at Vixio. So Vixio is a regulatory technology or RegTech company and a trusted source of independent, authoritative and actionable regulatory intelligence, compliance, regulatory strategy and development professionals in highly regulated industry undergoing rapid and radical change. We deliver comprehensive, time-sensitive and actionable intelligence on payments and gambling compliance, covering more than 180 jurisdictions across the globe and organised by product or service type. And to tell you who I am, I'm Jimmie Franklin, and I work as Senior Journalist at Vixio Payments Compliance. My role includes looking at some of those huge regulatory developments that are taking place at the moment in the payments and crypto space. I recall writing about DORA, for example, when it was first released by the European Commission way back in 2020, when actually I'd just started working at Vixio, and also was at that time covering MiCAR, which we'll be discussing a bit today as well, considering that they do link very well with one another. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my fantastic panelists today, who are all experts in this field. Jerome, let's start with you.
Thanks, Jimmie, for the intro. So I'm Jerome Dickinson. I'm a founder at Avroytech, so that's legal and regulatory consultancy with a particular focus on the Web3 space. I used to be an antitrust lawyer, then I went in-house to payments, and one thing led to the other, and I ended up in I still wonder how in the crypto space. Being very much involved, with MiCAR. I was a board member of Blockchain for Europe. Being a lawyer by day, but also a lobbyist by night, and been following a lot of fascinating topics like MiCAR, but also DORA that we're going to talk about today.
Fantastic, thanks very much. And Anja?
So I'm Anja. I'm a policy expert at the EUCI, European Crypto Initiative, which is a non-profit organization very similar to Blockchain for Europe, based in Brussels. We are supported by several crypto companies, Web3 companies such as Ethereum Foundation, Gnosis, Elusive, Masadi, etc. And basically, we do speak with the regulators. We tend to create a lot of position papers. We educate on both sides, basically on the industry side and on the regulatory side. Me, myself, I'm a lawyer by background, very similar to Jerome, doing two things at once. Yeah, I've been consulting crypto companies before, headed the advocacy group at the Blockchain European Hub, and one thing led to another, so this is where I am at today.
Fantastic, and last but certainly not least, Simon.
Thanks very much, Jimmie. So I'm making this a hat trick of lawyers. I am a lawyer, a senior associate in the Linklaters financial regulation team in London, and I've been following various fintech-related topics from EU developments in payment services regulation, MiCAR and crypto regulation more widely, and of course DORA and the UK corresponding rules as well here.
Brilliant, that sounds great. And just before I get started on the questions, I do want to say to our audience, please don't be afraid to send in your questions to our panelists today, and hopefully we can get a few of those answered at the end of the session. So I think if we were to start somewhere, a really good place would be a brief description of what DORA is. Obviously it's coming in January, but there may be some who are a bit unfamiliar with it at the moment. So I wonder if Simon, you could walk us through a bit of what DORA means.
What does DORA mean? Well, I suppose most simply it means a potential curveball for your implementation of MiCAR. As you say, it's regulation is coming in next year. And really what DORA is all about is ICT services. So these are the digital and data services that you rely on to provide your financial services. So what DORA does is get you to prepare today for the inevitable ICT disruption that is going to happen at some point in the future. And so therefore, it's not a surprise that DORA really is all about the management of operational risks and how you respond to ICT related incidents when they happen. And I mean, it's probably worth saying at the outset actually that you probably do a lot of this already. It's obviously vital for crypto asset businesses to be operationally resilient. I think what DORA does is prescribe in more detail exactly what it is the EU expects firms to be doing in this area, which because they're setting that in a regulation, that therefore exposes you to kind of new legal and regulatory risks on top of the obvious operational risks that apply in this area. It's interesting, Jimmie, you described this as a mammoth regulation, and I definitely agree with that. I think there, at the last count, are about 400 rules that apply to financial entities. And as we'll get on to talk about, it's not a spoiler to say that those financial entities include some crypto asset businesses. I suppose the other thing about DORA, which you'll know about, is that there's this, in addition to those 400 rules for financial entities, there's also a regime for tech firms, specifically those tech firms that are providing critical services to the European financial system. We can pick up on questions on that later maybe, but I think really probably the focus for today's discussion is going to be those rules as they apply to financial entities. And really, I think in terms of what those rules are, probably best to summarize them with 3 words. They all begin with the letter R, which is risk management, reporting, and repapering. So just briefly, risk management is basically all those plans, policies, procedures that you should have in place to prepare for ICT disruption and try to mitigate that disruption from happening in the first place. Reporting, so there's various requirements in DORA around what you need to have in place to communicate what those risks are to your regulators. You need to have a register of your ICT arrangements that you have with third parties. Obviously, when major incidents happen, you need to be telling your regulators about that. And then finally, repapering. So that's making sure your contracts with your ICT service providers are up to scratch, they're up to date, and they meet the specific requirements in DORA. And sometimes even the arrangements that your tech providers have with subcontractors further down the supply chain, they might need to be amended as well. So that's the brief introduction to what DORA is all about. I think it's fair to say that for all financial entities that are in the scope of DORA, full compliance by January is a daunting prospect.
Yeah, absolutely. But the word or the number 400 really stuck out to me there. I'm quite shocked by that. And I think it'd be really good to look at how crypto firms specifically are going to be affected by DORA and what crypto firms currently need to be considering when it comes to preparing for the deadline day, January 17th. I wonder, Anja, do you want to kick us off there?
Right, so first things first, it's always good to get familiar with what you have to comply with, right, in the first place. So spreading the news about DORA coming into place and becoming applicable, that's a must. That probably needs to be done on our side as well, and not just on the side of the industry and the regulators. So getting familiar with the rules that are going to apply and how they may affect your business or how they may affect your operations. That's the first thing. The second thing is really understanding who it applies to in the first place. So DORA really has these 2 types of entities maybe. One is that it primarily applies to the financial entities, right? But it also scopes in the ICT providers. So when it comes to crypto companies, you probably need to first figure out whether you may find yourself among those financial entities, as in you being an asset reference token provider or an electronic money institution, or maybe you're a CASP, crypto asset service provider, and you're scoped in because of that, or you may be perceived as the ITC provider. So those are two things. I do believe that a lot of crypto companies have already been doing the audits, which is the security testing right now, right? So those auditing firms may also want to get familiar with what are the new standards and what, for example, now has to be observed as the good practice, or something that is required for you to be compliant with. So getting prepared beforehand, that's most likely the first step to go for. Another thing that can also be done right now is continue to negotiate or continue to educate and to provide your input, noting that, for example, the regulation has already closed and that it already has been accepted as is. That does not mean that the negotiation phase is completely over, right? So there is still ongoing discussions, let's say the open regulatory technical standards. So how, for example, this regulation applies in details, this is something that the regulators address with the measures level 2. So when it comes to those measures, we've responded to the RDSs already, and yet there is a couple of questions that remained open and that we would like the regulators to address into further details. And this is where the auditing firms, where the crypto companies can also kind of pitch in their line of thoughts and possibly their experience. So really understanding, for example, how the security checks and how the audits have worked so far and how they may have to develop further or how they will have to amend so that they will all be compliant with DORA. Those are now the open questions that we seek answers to. And consulting with the auditing firms really sort of looks like, hey, are you even familiar with DORA in the first place? No? Okay, let's begin there. So the more dialogue that we have before January 2025, the better on this particular topic. The more webinars we have like this, the better, of course. And then we'll see making baby steps towards that is always a good option as well.
Fantastic. And Jerome, obviously we've had a lot of conversations about crypto and DORA in the past. I wonder if there's anything you wanted to add to that in terms of what crypto firms need to be considering at the moment.
Well, it's difficult considering that Simon and Anja pretty much summed it up very well. So I'll try to walk into the steps. But generally speaking, to underline what has been said. So yeah, cybersecurity requirements for regulated financial institutions, including regulated crypto service providers or issuers under DORA. The large CASPs that you talk to seem very aware that this is happening. You and I already had these discussions, Jimmie. My estimate, this is just a guess estimate, that most of the CASPs today that are active in Europe are not going to survive the double combo MiCAR plus DORA purge that's coming, because you just have so many little actors out there that won't necessarily have the resources to get prepared. So that's either going to be a good thing or bad thing. I mean, there's I feel going to be concentration in the market, but generally speaking, the CAS do know that this, the crypto service providers do know that this is coming. Where sometimes I'm a little bit more surprised is the third-party providers, the critical third-party providers. Granted, some of the level 2 criteria is still being defined as we speak. We don't exactly know who's going to be, who or what is going to be critical, but we can guess that in the case of crypto, blockchain analytics firms, wallet infrastructure service providers like Fireblocks, are typically going to be, I'm not saying they are going to be critical, but prime candidates to being critical, because crypto exchanges cannot do without them. And if these services go down, then you'll have major disruptions. So it's likely that some of these types of services will be caught, and some of them will probably be caught off guard, because when you talk to them, don't want to name any names, they're a little surprised, and it's only 6 months away, so they've got very little time to comply.
No, absolutely. And I think on that slightly worrying note, I think it'd be good to consider are there any crypto firms that perhaps, or parts of the crypto industry that maybe won't have to comply with DORA? Is there any part that aren't really going to have to worry too much about this big deadline that's just around the corner? And I think you might have some views on this from times we've spoken in the past.
Right. So when we are referring to crypto companies, I think we are referring to a very broad spectrum of all the companies out there. It's really not a black and white scenario, and it's really not just about the finances any longer, right? So before, maybe mostly when we are referring to crypto in the past, what happened was that we mostly had in mind the DeFi companies, the token issuers. So there was quite often this financial component to them. Today, that's no longer the case. So something that we have quite often now started to emphasize is that there's also a refi movement, so regenerative finances. There's also DAOs. There is plenty of these development companies that are dealing or building on top of blockchain, so distributed ledger technologies, but don't really fall into the sector that we would either call the financial entity, or they may not even be perceived as providing the ICT services, or at least not being mature to that level where, for example, they would be required to do the penetration testing the way DORA prescribes it. So this has been something that we have been mentioning in our responses to the regulatory technical standards, the consultation papers that have been issued by the EU regulators. That's really something that we are not clear just yet. So noting that blockchain technology is rather a novel technology that has only been developed, let's say, a decade ago, and that there is really continuous development, there's continuous cutting edge technology development. We don't really perceive lots of those technological stacks to be mature enough. Now, we don't have clarity when it comes to how or what we perceived as being mature enough from the ICT perspective. And this is definitely something worth discussing further. But to be very honest, I mean, there may as well be some crypto asset service providers that could be perceived to not be mature enough to that point. So they could as well be accepted from those obligations where, for example, they wouldn't be obliged to provide or completely conduct the tests. So that's an open question, but yes, to answer in short, there's plenty of those crypto companies that utilize the blockchain technology, but that may not actually fall under the scope of DORA.
Nice. And do you have much, or are you speaking with regulators much at the moment about who is in scope and who isn't in scope? Have you got much of an idea from those regulators?
Right, so this has been a written response so far, and it has only been submitted basically a couple of weeks ago, right? So we are yet to receive the full response from the regulator. This again is an ongoing conversation. We may as well enter into some verbal communication with them. Right now, it's a bit tricky, to be very honest, because we are in the midst of having these elections coming up in Europe as well. So we're being very mindful of who's going to be the next one leading the office, or who's actually, putting some stuff on the agenda. So we're trying to keep an eye on what the new political fora are going to look like. So we're going to have much more clarity with regard to that in summer, so June this year. But yeah, this we don't have the concrete answers just yet.
Of course. And I wonder at the moment, what do you think are the main risks that come up with DORA? And that could be for different parts of the crypto sector or the financial services sector in general. One thing I always think that maybe is a bit of a hindrance to crypto firms, but also payments and e-money firms, is these aren't as big a financial institutions as some of the banks who are already going to have these huge infrastructures in place, perhaps, to be able to comply with things like DORA. Simon, it'd be good if you could give us a bit of insight there.
Yeah, I think it can work two ways, because I think if I were a bank with lots of legacy systems, and I know that I need to uplift those to meet DORA requirements, I'd actually look quite enviously at maybe a smaller, leaner company that is even one that is completely reliant on digital technology. But I completely agree. Certainly from the point of view of your risk and compliance setup, you're going to need to invest both from a MiCAR point of view, but then also DORA. I mean, in terms of what the risks are, from my point of view, clearly the risk is that you don't meet the standards, and that's a problem both at the point when you are applying for your license, for your MiCAR license, because I have absolutely no doubt that regulators are going to zoom in on business continuity and how you propose to comply with DORA when you are putting in your application for a MiCAR license. And frankly, if the regulator is looking for an excuse to refuse your application, then DORA might just give them the justification for doing that. But even, let's say, there's a point in the future where you are licensed, there is then this new, as I said earlier, this new regulatory risk that you've got to manage, which is that if an incident happens and the regulator then comes and looks at your risk management processes and is obviously doing so with the benefit of hindsight because an incident has crystallized, if they conclude that your processes weren't up to scratch, then that could lead to enforcement action taken by the regulator for failing to meet with these onerous DORA obligations that we talked about before. And frankly, DORA sets a high bar, so you're probably not going to meet all of DORA all the time. So hopefully regulators are going to take a sensible and a risk-based approach, but it's important to note that this is another tool in their toolkit, which could lead to, as I say, enforcement action, fines, or potentially in some cases worse.
And actually this week I've noticed that Malta and also the Netherlands have released guidance on what their expectations are for compliance and preparing to comply as well. Malta, for example, is doing DSCO letters, ramping firms up in that country on how they can comply with DORA. Jerome, obviously you said earlier about some crypto firms risking being wiped out by DORA and MiCAR. I wonder, so what do you think the main risks that firms could pay attention to now so that it's so they don't get wiped out, basically?
Okay, well, as both Anja and Simon suggested, they should invest because at the end of the day, the compliance costs are going to be huge, just behind DORA. I'm not even talking about MiCAR here. So we're talking audits, we're talking investing in also internal resources to make sure that you meet all the requirements. So that's time and money. With very little time to comply if you're only getting started now. I mean, to some extent, Simon mentioned earlier the size, being envious of leaner, smaller, digital-only structures, from the point of view of banks or large financial institutions, and that's a very valid point. But at the same time, a lot of these crypto firms do not yet have the culture of compliance, so they're starting from scratch. And there's it's a very steep learning curve. So very little time and very much there's a lot to do. So that's probably the biggest risk, that they don't comply. Well, they either don't comply at all because they've never heard of DORA, or they have heard of DORA, but they're falling short of where they need to be. And yes, indeed, the fines are very hefty. So something to watch out for.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I completely agree with Jerome, actually, and it might be again an opportunity for the regulators to, I suppose, make a statement to some extent, because in this not too distant future, when we've got a range of MiCAR licensed firms who, as Jerome rightly says, might not have this same culture of compliance setups as other types of financial entity, the regulators might be looking to use DORA as an opportunity to remind those firms of what the standard is as a regulated institution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, how does DORA align or link with MiCAR? Like, let's say if you were going for a license, a MiCAR license in an EU member state, would you need to show that you're compliant with DORA, or would you need to comply with DORA beforehand? Or how does that work exactly? I wonder who wants to take that.
I can take it briefly and then you just add on top of that. I think everybody actually has something very great to contribute to. So first off, I don't think I've seen any such requirements so far in the RDSs explaining what, for example, the companies will have to submit to their regulators when they notify them or when they apply for the license so far. That would relate to DORA. There has been, however, the third batch coming from ESMA just recently that touches upon the operational resilience and DORA as well, being mentioned there. DORA, however, does refer to MiCAR when it defines its scope. So I think Article 2 defines the scope. And there's 2 points, or actually just 1 point, which was really interesting to see because there's CASPs being mentioned and scoped in, and the RTS providers. So the asset reference tokens providers, token issuers are going to be scoped in, and they will have to comply with DORA. Interestingly enough, what we saw is that the e-money tokens weren't directly mentioned there, and it almost seems as if there is some sort of a not really misconception, but misalignment between DORA and MiCAR on that point. And this is not the only case. So noting that this is now a mammoth regulatory framework, and there is plenty of different regulatory frameworks that are actually going to, come at once, and that people and companies will have to comply with. It's really becoming trickier to find out how to comply with all of them at once, and where the intersections are, and whether those are actually covered very well. So noting that different regulations are referring to each other, and how exactly they refer to each other, it's really becoming a bit strange. So just to kind of mention, like the DORA mentions electronic money institutions, which we think may actually scope in the e-money token issuers as well. But again, we're not very clear on that, right? So it's all going to be applicable at once, and you will have to comply with all of them. But there's going to be different regulators, different authorities that are going to have the authority to actually oversee and control and monitor your actions. So I think that's going to be the tricky part. So having the capacity to really speak or open the dialogues with different regulators, noting that, for example, for MiCAR, you mostly are going to have the conversations happening between you and the national competent authority. And for DORA, it's not really going to be the case. It's going to be a different authority that is going to have an oversight for that part. And yet, yes, there might be some reporting that the regulators are also going to do among themselves. Hopefully that's going to be mandatory between themselves, so we are not going to be obliged to take all the documents and bring it to another regulator later on. But yeah, it's all at once and with different regulators that you will have to communicate with.
Interesting. So on the e-money token front, and I think I've seen at least a few people in Brussels, at least, who raised this as a concern, how the e-money institutions and e-money tokens link. Should e-money tokens take the reference to e-money institutions as a reason to comply with DORA, would you say? Sorry to put you on the spot a bit there.
I mean, this is, why it's problematic is because we perceive the e-money tokens as being a subset of crypto assets. So basically what MiCAR has done so far is it really categorizes different tokens into different categories, right? And mainly we have 2 different categories. One is the stable coins, meaning either the asset reference tokens or e-money tokens, and all the rest of the crypto assets that are not those 2 stable coins. There is also a category of utility tokens, etc. The NFTs are also being mentioned, but that may not really be so important for DORA. And noting that, for example, the e-money tokens are part of MiCAR, and that MiCAR provides the obligations for the e-money tokens, token issuers, and that it also has the competent authority named for that. That's a completely different aspect than, for example, all the licensing and all the obligations that are mentioned in the e-money directive, and possibly even the PSD3, that's upcoming regulatory framework. So right now there's a lot of discussions, like you mentioned already, on how exactly this is going to differentiate, and whether, for example, if you are an e-money token issuer, whether you'll have to gain that license, or whether you'll have to get both, or whether those are exclusive. Exactly how the relationship there is going to be built. Those are the things that are now being addressed or communicated to both ESMA and EBA, so the European Banking Authority, and we're basically having those answers pending. So again, not so clear just yet, but those are hopefully the things that will be clarified before June 2024, just because MiCAR becomes applicable for stablecoin issuers by then. Then the rest, of course, can follow. Possibly not even the regulators are going to have all the answers by then, but the sooner the better for everybody so that we know how to prepare for compliance.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if either Simon or Jerome want to jump in on that as well.
I mean, I can start and build on some of the things that Anja was saying. So certainly if you're new to regulation, welcome to the wonderful world of the complex intersection between different pieces of legislation. I think maybe it's a point which is implied in some of the comments that we've already made, but it's worth making explicit, which is looking at DORA. We've talked about how it applies to financial entities, broad range of different categories of firm, but practically everyone who is authorised under an EU regime is brought within DORA. So it's very much a case of bringing everyone up to the same level, harmonising standards across the entirety of the EU financial system. And then what DORA does is it doesn't really distinguish between different types of financial entity in the rules that it's then setting. So there isn't a section in DORA which is for crypto firms or a section which is for asset managers. It's applying consistent rules across the board. And that's significant when it comes to scoping. So as Anja was describing, there are these MiCAR licensed firms which are explicitly, in scope. So these are ART issuers and CASPs. Also, as you were saying, Anja, it applies to e-money institutions. So if you've had to get authorized as an e-money institution to issue an e-money token, then I would say you are in the scope of DORA and you're applying that as well. And then there is very little in DORA that then lightens the regime for you if you are a smaller institution. There are some simplifications for micro enterprises, but those limitations are limited. So it is very much a complete package that you then have to implement. I would note as well that there is this proportionality principle in DORA, which allows you to apply DORA standards according to the nature of the organization and the kind of risks that you run. Unhelpfully, though, that proportionality principle doesn't actually switch off any requirements. So, it could just be as equal or as legitimate to argue that actually I'm running more risks as a certain type of firm, and so therefore I might need to even go above and beyond what DORA requires. But in terms of the interconnection between DORA and MiCAR, really, I think if you have a license under MiCAR, you also need to be thinking about DORA.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Jerome, did you want to add anything to
that? No.
Okay, no.
I think they pretty much summed it all. I agree with all the above. It's a lot of overlapping questions between the different pieces of legislation, and I suppose also, I think it's a brave new world. There's still no precedent. No one really knows ahead of time. No one has a crystal ball. So we all know here the principles and the overarching structure, but we have yet to see how things are going to be implemented. So I'm sure there are known unknowns and things are going to pop up that we hadn't expected. So I think now, all eyes are on the next couple of months to see how what's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe Jimmie.
Sorry, Anja, carry on.
Yeah, just to maybe add one more point, because I kind of have a feeling that we've been addressing DORA and MiCAR in a very negative way, maybe, and just to kind of focus on one positive thing there as well. I think that DORA almost presents like a low-hanging fruit for the auditing firms that have been so far doing extremely good audits for Web3 companies. Reason there being, this is really just going to be yet another standard, and DORA already addresses the companies that are going to be the external testers to whomever needs to comply with DORA, right? And those external testers could be perceived to be the auditing firms that have been offering their services so far. So again, it really is a low-hanging fruit that can be taken and possibly put into the benefits, or the companies may actually be making some really nice profit out of it as well. And it's not really as in, just about the profits or just about making the benefits. It's really for the sake of the security of the Web3 community and the Web3 ecosystem as well, because this is something that we've been focusing in the past quite often, in a way where we were trying to push for better security, for more audits in this space. A lot of people have been deploying smart contracts that have not been properly audited, and speaking to the auditors in the past, it became almost evident that as much as we don't really want the regulators to come up with a new standard for smart contracts, there was like a missing link, or everybody was kind of pointing out that, yeah, we do have a problem because we don't know who audits the auditors at the end of the day. There's all these different firms. We are all relying on different audited parts of the code already. But when it comes to what is the life cycle of this certificate or of this audit that I have gone through, and whether the smart contract once deployed needs to be audited yet again, how often, the frequency, all these tiny little bits are now being very nicely addressed. So having some baseline standardization could as well very much help the auditing firms. And on the other side, the Web3 companies that are going to have to comply and will be relying on the rules that are going to be a bit more certain.
Absolutely fantastic. And actually that does tie in with what my next question was going to be. In terms of the amount of regulation that is coming for crypto firms at the moment, whether that be MiCAR or DORA, or also the TFR or travel rule being implemented, what do you think that means for the crypto industry in Europe? Is it a good thing? Is there a positive side to that? Is it going to be like good for the crypto industry?
Simon, will you or will I?
Oh, why don't you can start? You can start, and I've definitely got some things to say. You start, and I'll chip in.
I think in one word, Jimmie, I'd say maturity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, no one knows ahead of time, okay, what was going to happen, but this is a fast maturing industry. It even matures exponentially because things move so quickly in crypto. It's very much trial and error. You know, sometimes you feel like we have to go through these scandals with all sorts of things going wrong in order for the industry to learn from it, for policymakers and regulators to learn from all of this, and then these things get codified. So yeah, there's a lot. There's MiCAR, the TFR, but in many ways, you know, people are often saying that the crypto space was there to kill off the traditional financial industry, and I'm getting a sense at this stage, at least, I don't know if the others agree with me, that if anything, we're witnessing a merge, a merge between the crypto and the traditional financial industry. That, you know, they never wanted to mix, but they are merging, and at least for the centralized crypto industry, you know, the same standards that apply for financial institutions are kind of being transposed. So it's interesting now that they all these same standards are going to apply to them. Now, obviously, you know, DeFi and all sorts of other areas. You know, there are many things going in the crypto world that, you know, are still out of scope of some of these regulations. But crypto exchanges or crypto issuers are now going to become, well, traditional financial actors like any other, by virtue of all these standards that are kicking in. So I think that, in a word, is you know, my 2 cents on this.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I would say DORA and the way that it applies to the you know, MiCAR firms is a sign of things to come. And it's really, I suppose, underlining the point that crypto regulation doesn't end with MiCAR. You as a crypto firm are going to be increasingly embedded into the regulatory framework as time goes by. I'll give another example, which is we've seen the Commission, European Commission last year, publish proposals for a framework for open finance. So this is a regulation which will require financial entities to share customer information between themselves, and that applies to firms with a MiCAR license. So, you know, in the future, as a authorized, you know, MiCAR firm, you might be one of those firms that is having to share this customer data and with your peers and with other financial entities. So it's very much a case that you are put on an equal footing with other entities in the EU. And actually, it's not just at the EU level either, because I think once you're inside this regulatory bubble, I think we're also going to see national regimes coming into play. To give one example, it's not inconceivable, I think, that in Ireland, for example, they would apply the senior executive regime to regulated crypto firms at some point in the future. They haven't said that yet, but those kind of national regimes could start to bite on MiCAR firms once they are within this regulatory bubble.
Interesting. Yeah. And Anja, is there anything you wanted to add?
I mean, 6 or even more years ago, there was one main question that probably still remains open in several jurisdictions, and that is my crypto going to be taxed, and how? These questions still persist in many cases. But yeah, there's so many more regulatory frameworks that have started to apply, and to some extent, I completely agree with Jerome and Simon. This is really just an example and kind of pushes towards the merge of the traditional world on one side and the Web3 world, which basically started very much with the anarchistic note attached to it, right? So how the systems are going to be disrupted. Today, it's no longer just about that disruption. It's actually going to be a bit more about how we can merge those, because both of those two words actually have something great to contribute to the user experience at the end of the day. And the more regulation that we have in this space, I think the better for the traditional sector to become a bit more open to this innovation, because so far it has been really tough for them. They did not know who to rely on to. I mean, for users, it's at your own risk. So if you want to go with a DEX, if you want to go with something that is not having a MiCAR license, sure, go for it. It's going to be at your own risk again. But for somebody that is a traditional player that wants to offer something through traditional forms, they need to rely, they need to know, they need to kind of partner with somebody that has all the appropriate licenses in place. So this is really going to help merge these two sectors. When I mentioned that there is many more regulatory frameworks or many more regulation in place, we tend to say that it's really for the best of everybody, right? So even MiCAR itself, it's here because of the stablecoins, it's here because of the monetary sovereignty of the EU, and it's here because we, at the end, want to protect the interests of investors and of the end users. So that's great. There's also Product Liability Directive, there's also Data Act. There is a bunch of incoming regulatory frameworks that now address the essential requirements, let's say, for the smart contracts on one side. So those will have to be taken into consideration by developers because they're going to be responsible for that compliance. And when it comes to the liability directive, it's again all about how we perceive the software, whether that includes the distributed ledger technology, the consensus protocols, the smart contract itself, and who at the end of the day is going to be responsible for how it actually performs the actions. And those are just the tiny little bits, right? You mentioned the TFR, so the transfer of funds regulation, the AML, and how the KYC is going to have to be conducted now. So there's plenty more. But yes, again, all for the benefit of the users and the investors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that something I've seen quite a lot is people beyond the EU saying that actually, although MiCAR will be quite burdensome to implement, it does mean people know where they stand. And I think it does bring a certain level of mainstreamification of crypto, which perhaps wouldn't be possible without a framework like that. So before I hand back to Jack, we did get some questions in from the audience. One of them, and I don't know if any of you want to take this, is does DORA need to be referenced in contracts with third parties? And is this a case of all contracts now needing to be renegotiated, like let's say with your ICT provider?
I can take that one. So I think where to begin. So if you are one of these in-scope firms that we've been talking about, I don't think it's simply a case of you referencing DORA in your contracts, but I think there is likely to be contracts that you will have to ensure meeting the DORA standards. It might be that it already is in some cases, but it's worth checking against the rules that are in DORA, because there will almost certainly be at least some rights or obligations that you need to insert into those contracts that you have with your ICT service providers to make sure that they are ticking all the boxes in DORA. I don't want to make DORA sound like a tick box exercise, but it is to some extent. You've got to make sure that you can demonstrate that you've met all the requirements. I think the other thing I would note in that regard, when you're looking at contracts, is that there are different rules that apply to different types of ICT service arrangement. So look at yourself as a crypto firm. What are your critical or important functions? And then think, well, what are the ICT services that I'm relying on to provide those critical or keep those critical important functions going? Because those ICT services that are supporting those critical and important functions, they have additional obligations attaching to them, which is going to impact the contractual arrangement. So several things to think about there, but certainly DORA does have an impact on those ICT service contracts.
Yeah, maybe just to add, because it seems that it would be worth explaining a bit further. This is, in fact, a regulation. So quite often people don't really differentiate between what the Europe calls a directive and what's called a regulation. So DORA is a regulation, which means it has a very similar impact to, for example, the GDPR. So you don't have to put it into the national law necessarily. The states are not going to be asked to impose it into their national laws. It's going to be very much directly having the effect. Which also means that all the obliged entities will have to comply with the requirements in there, regardless of whether you're going to be scoping that in or referencing it in your contract or not. This is similar to, for example, GDPR. If you have a privacy policy, or if you have, let's say, a contract with somebody that gives you all the data of their users, you don't have to necessarily refer to the GDPR clauses. Those are going to be directly imposed on you.
Nice, fantastic. I think that's yeah, I have seen the GDPR DORA comparison before, I guess, in terms of the amount of people it's actually going to be an issue for in the next few months. So I guess a final question for all of you, and this might be quite broad, but if there was, as we reach the final countdown, let's say before D-Day for DORA, what would you say is your kind of main piece of advice to the compliance departments of different crypto firms in terms of preparing for this piece of regulation? Who wants to start?
I will.
Go ahead, Jerome.
Well, to some extent, I'm going to repeat some of the points that were made before, but do get going, because it's the deadlines are fast approaching, and you do want to make sure that you have sufficient resources in-house or externally to manage all the requirements, because there are many. I didn't know about the 400. I'm not mixed actually count, but certainly very much. I am hopeful that the crypto exchanges that are going to survive are going to be able to handle this, and they know it's coming, and they're already putting in place arrangements to comply. Where I'm a little bit more wary, or have a bit more question mark, is for some of the critical third-party providers. So again, the blockchain analytics, the KYC providers. Well, to some extent, we don't really know what the criticality criteria are exactly. They're not completely defined yet. But I think that some of these third-party providers are underestimate this is going to concern them, and the extent to which it's going to concern them, because they will also be, for those that are caught, directly supervised by the European Banking Authority, and they'll have to pay supervision fees. They'll also be subject to fines if they don't comply. So I would really sound the alarm bells to the critical third-party providers that service the crypto exchanges or the regulated crypto actors generally.
Fantastic. Anja?
Right. Probably, I would say, don't be afraid. The regulations, as much as they can be quite comprehensive and burdensome. It's good to be familiar with them early on, to get ahead of the game, to really know what's in or how it may impact your business, to see what you can do to actually benefit your company, to benefit your community, and to kind of take it into consideration with a positive note, because nonetheless it's here, and the way people have perceived it from the rest of the cyber space, it's really been welcomed, as in these have been the standards that have been put in place into practice already before. They have been observed in practice by numerous companies. So they have been positively surprised by how well the regulators have actually taken this into consideration and how they have been putting in place the regulation in its own. So again, take it as a positive note, take it into consideration as soon as possible, and see how it can actually help you grow.
Yeah, sounds good. And Simon?
So if I had one bit of advice for risk and compliance teams that are looking to implement DORA, I would probably say engage your senior management on this as soon as possible, because it's actually explicit in DORA that your management body is ultimately responsible for managing operational risks, and frankly they're going to see a lot more information coming their way. All the various plans, policies, procedures that I mentioned at the outset that form part of your ICT risk management framework, they're going to be put in front of their noses. They're going to have to sign them off. They are going to have to receive more metrics about the operational performance of the business. So definitely getting them on board and on side sooner rather than later, I think, will ease your implementation journey overall. And I want to take a leaf out of Anja's book and end on a positive note, because I do think, and I do agree actually, that these rules are in place, especially DORA, for a common good. Actually, bringing up the resilience of the market as a whole, I think, is only a good thing.
Fantastic. Well, guys, it's been a pleasure to speak to you all today. I think that we've covered a lot when it's come to DORA, and I'll take Anja's advice of doing more webinars on this topic throughout the year, because I think that it is going to continue to be a very pressing topic until January 17th next year. I hope everyone's had a informative session today, and I'm going to pass back now to my colleague, Jack.
Thank you, Jimmie, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. A big thank you again to our panel of speakers. It's been a pleasure to hear from you today. As mentioned at the start of the session, this webinar was recorded and a video will be sent to all attendees later today. Now, before signing off, I just wanted to share some news. On Wednesday, the 3rd of April, Vixio will be hosting a LinkedIn Live featuring today's moderator, Jimmie Franklin. So be sure to join us at 2 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time or 9 a.m. Eastern Time. And normally these will be on the first Monday of every month, but as it's a bank holiday weekend in the UK, we're moving it to Wednesday. So make sure you visit the Vixio LinkedIn page for a breakdown review of the biggest regulatory changes to the payments industry that has happened over the past month. If you have any further questions about anything to discuss in today's webinar, please be sure to reach out to us via any of the methods you see on the screen there. But the easiest way is to email info@vixio.com or visit our website, vixio.com, for more information. Thank you again.